Ghastly Garlic Episode 48. The Haunted Ward. A double dose of terrifying tales. The first dose, The Wandering Woman. Prologue. The first encounter. The hospital had always had an unsettling aura, but Samantha Collins had never felt it as strongly as she did on her first night shift. She had only recently transferred to one of the hospital in Melbourne, drawn by its reputation and the opportunity to advance her nursing career. But as she walked down the dimly lit corridors, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The building was old, with architecture that spoke of another era, high ceilings, long hallways, and wooden floors that creaked underfoot. The walls were lined with faded photographs of the hospital's early days, images of doctors and nurses posing stiffly in black and white. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, overlaid with something older, something musty that hinted at the building's long history. It was past midnight, and the usual bustle of the day had given way to an eerie stillness. The only sounds were the occasional beeping of monitors and the distant murmur of voices from the nurses' station. Samantha's footsteps echoed loudly, and she found herself walking faster, eager to return to the relative safety of the well-lit station. As she passed by the old surgical ward, something caught her eye. At the far end of the hallway, near the door that led to the storage rooms, she saw a figure. It was an elderly woman, hunched over and wearing what looked like an outdated hospital gown. Her white hair was disheveled, and she seemed to be moving slowly, almost as if she was struggling to stay upright. Samantha frowned. She didn't remember seeing any elderly patients in this section earlier. Concerned, she called out, "Are you all right? Do you need help?" The woman didn't respond. She continued to shuffle forward, her back to Samantha. There was something unsettling about the way she moved, stiff, almost mechanical, as if she were being pulled along by some invisible force. Samantha quickened her pace, closing the distance between them. You shouldn't be out of bed. Let me help you back to your room." But as she got closer, the woman turned a corner and disappeared from view. Samantha hurried to follow, but when she rounded the corner, she found herself staring at a dead end. The hallway ended abruptly with a solid brick wall. There was no sign of the elderly woman, no door she could have gone through. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest. She looked around, trying to make sense of what she had just seen. The hallway was empty, silent except for the faint buzzing of the overhead lights. She took a step back, feeling a cold sweat break out on her forehead. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone there?" No answer. The silence was deafening, pressing in on her from all sides. Samantha took another step back, her pulse racing. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing up, as if someone, or something, was watching her. She forced herself to turn around and walk back to the nurse's station, her steps quickening with each passing second. When she finally reached the brightly lit room, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. The normalcy of the station, with its computers and paperwork, grounded her, but the image of the old woman lingered in her mind. As she sat down at her desk, trying to calm herself, one thought kept repeating in her head. Who was that woman, and where had she gone? Chapter 1. Shadows of the Past. The next morning, Samantha couldn't stop thinking about the elderly woman. The image of her shuffling down the hallway haunted her thoughts, and no matter how much she tried to rationalize it, something didn't add up. She decided to ask one of the more experienced nurses about it. During her break, Samantha found Helen, a nurse who had been working at the hospital for over 20 years. Helen was in her late 50s, with graying hair pulled back into a neat bun and a no-nonsense attitude that came from years of experience. "Helen," Samantha began cautiously, "can I ask you something?" Helen looked up from her coffee, raising an eyebrow. "Of course, dear. What's on your mind?" Samantha hesitated, unsure of how to phrase her question. "Have you ever seen anything strange around here? At night, I mean." Helen's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, recognition, perhaps. "Strange? What kind of strange are we talking about?" Samantha took a deep breath and described what she had seen. The elderly woman, the outdated gown, the way she had disappeared into thin air. As she spoke, she watched Helen's face carefully. When she finished, Helen set her coffee cup down with a sigh. "You saw her, didn't you?" Samantha felt a chill run down her spine. "So, you know about her?" Helen nodded slowly. She's been here for as long as I can remember. Some of the older staff call her the Wandering Woman. She appears at night, always in the same hallway, always moving towards that dead end. And then she's gone. Who is she? Samantha asked, leaning in closer. Was she a patient here? Helen shook her head. No one knows for sure. There are stories, of course. Old rumors passed down from one generation of nurses to the next. Some say she was a patient who died here. Others think she might have been a nurse who never left. But whatever the case, she's been here for decades. Samantha felt a shiver crawl up her spine. Has anyone ever tried to find out more? To figure out why she's here? Some have, Helen said, her voice dropping to a whisper. But it's never ended well. People who dig too deep into her past, they start seeing her more often. She doesn't like being disturbed. Samantha swallowed hard, her mind racing. What happens to them? Helen looked away, her expression darkening. They leave. Or worse, some have had accidents. Others just couldn't take it anymore and quit. It's like she follows them, haunts them until they break. The words sent a chill through Samantha. She had always been a skeptic when it came to the supernatural, but there was something in Helen's tone, something in the way she spoke, that made her believe every word. What should I do? Samantha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Helen met her gaze, her expression serious. Leave it alone. Whatever you saw, just forget about it. Go about your work, and don't let her get to you. The less you think about her, the better. But as Samantha walked away from their conversation, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. The image of the old woman was burned into her mind, and the mystery of who she was, and why she was still there, gnawed at her curiosity. No matter how much she wanted to forget, she couldn't. And deep down, Samantha knew that she wouldn't be able to leave it alone. She had to know the truth. Chapter 2, Digging into History. The hospital's archives were located in the basement, a place that few people visited. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and dust, and the dim lighting cast long shadows across the rows of shelves filled with forgotten records. Samantha spent her next few days off sifting through these records, searching for any mention of the mysterious woman she had seen. It was tedious work, and the sheer volume of documents was overwhelming. Most of the files were old patient records, some dating back to the early 1900s, when the hospital had first opened. As she dug deeper, Samantha came across a series of incident reports from the 1950s. One file in particular caught her attention, a report about a patient named Margaret O'Reilly. The file was old, the pages yellowed with age, and the handwriting was barely legible. Margaret had been admitted in 1953 with severe dementia. The notes described her as a difficult patient, prone to wandering, often confused and agitated. There were several reports of her disappearing from her room and being found in different parts of the hospital, sometimes in the middle of the night. The staff had tried to keep a close eye on her, but one night, she had vanished completely. The search for Margaret had been extensive. The police had been called, and the hospital staff had scoured every inch of the building, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had simply disappeared into thin air. The report concluded with a note that Margaret was presumed dead, although no body was ever found. Samantha felt a chill as she read the final lines. Could this be the woman she had seen? Had Margaret O'Reilly's spirit been wandering the halls of the hospital for all these years, searching for something or someone? Determined to find out more, Samantha continued her research. She dug through old newspaper archives, looking for any mention of Margaret's disappearance. She found a small article in a local paper from 1953, detailing the search for the missing woman. The article mentioned that Margaret had a daughter, Evelyn, who had been devastated by her mother's disappearance. Evelyn had been a young woman at the time, and there was no further information about her. Samantha's mind raced with possibilities. If Margaret was the ghost haunting the hospital, what was keeping her here? Was she searching for her daughter? And if so, what could Samantha do to help her find peace? The more she thought about it, the more determined she became. She couldn't ignore this, not when there was a chance to help Margaret's spirit move on. But she also knew that she would need to be careful. If what Helen had said was true, then digging too deep could have dangerous consequences. Still, Samantha couldn't turn back now. She had to know the truth, no matter the cost. Chapter 3, The First Confrontation. As the days passed, Samantha began to feel the weight of her decision. She had been seeing the old woman more frequently, always in the same hallway, always moving towards the same dead end. Each time, the encounter left her feeling drained, as if the very presence of the ghost was sapping her strength. Her colleagues began to notice the change in her. Samantha's once bright demeanor had dimmed, replaced by a constant sense of unease. She was jumpy, her nerves on edge, and she found it difficult to concentrate on her work. The other nurses whispered about her, casting worried glances in her direction, but no one dared to ask what was wrong. One night, as she was making her rounds, Samantha felt a sudden chill in the air. The temperature seemed to drop by several degrees, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She knew, even before she turned the corner, that the old woman was there. Margaret was standing in the middle of the hallway, her back to Samantha, just as she had been the first time they met. But this time, there was something different about her posture. She seemed more solid, more present, as if she had gained strength since their last encounter. Samantha took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Margaret," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "I know who you are." The old woman stopped moving but didn't turn around. Samantha could hear the faint sound of her breathing, raspy and labored, like someone who had been running for a long time. "I've been looking for you," Samantha continued, taking another step closer. "I found out what happened to you. You disappeared from the hospital in 1953. They never found your body." Margaret remained silent, her figure still as a statue. The shadows around her seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides, and Samantha felt a wave of fear wash over her. But she pushed it aside, determined to reach the woman. "Margaret, your daughter, Evelyn, she's still alive. She's been waiting for you all these years. She never stopped looking for you." At the mention of Evelyn's name, the old woman finally moved. She turned slowly to face Samantha, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and longing. The sight of her up close sent a shiver down Samantha's spine. Margaret's face was pale and gaunt, her skin stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes were hollow, and her lips were cracked and dry, as if she hadn't had a drop of water in decades. "Evelyn." Margaret's voice was a whisper, barely audible over the sound of Samantha's pounding heart. "Yes, Evelyn," Samantha said, stepping closer still. "She's been waiting for you, Margaret. She needs to know what happened to you. She needs closure." For a moment, Margaret just stared at Samantha, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she began to nod. "Evelyn, my Evelyn." The lights in the hallway flickered, and the shadows seemed to recede slightly. Margaret's form became less defined, more transparent, as if she were fading away. Samantha felt a surge of hope. Perhaps she had done it. Perhaps she had helped the spirit find peace. But just as quickly as the hope appeared, it was dashed. Margaret's eyes suddenly widened in terror, and she let out a low, mournful wail that echoed through the corridor. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard, grating against Samantha's nerves and filling her with a sense of dread. "Margaret, what's wrong?" Samantha asked, panic rising in her chest. "What's happening?" But Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she turned and began to walk towards the dead end, her steps slow and deliberate. Samantha watched in horror as the old woman reached the wall and, without hesitation, walked straight into it. There was a loud crack, like the sound of bones breaking, and Margaret's figure crumpled to the floor. For a split second, Samantha thought she saw something, some dark, shapeless entity, emerge from the wall, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Margaret lay on the floor, her body twisted at an unnatural angle, her eyes wide and unseeing. Samantha felt bile rise in her throat, and she stumbled backward, unable to tear her eyes away from the horrifying sight. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The hallway returned to its normal state, the temperature rising back to a comfortable level. Margaret's body was gone, and the only sign that anything had happened was the lingering sense of unease that clung to the air. Samantha took a few shaky breaths, trying to calm her racing heart. She knew, without a doubt, that whatever had just happened was not normal. Margaret's spirit was not at peace, and there was something much darker at play here. And now, more than ever, Samantha knew she couldn't stop. She had to find out the truth, no matter what it cost her. Chapter 4, The Dark History. Samantha's search for answers led her down a path she hadn't anticipated. The more she learned about the hospital's history, the more she realized that Margaret's disappearance was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. There were other stories, other disappearances that had been swept under the rug over the years. She started with the oldest records she could find, dating back to the hospital's early days in the late 1800s. The hospital had originally been a sanatorium for tuberculosis patients, and the conditions had been harsh. Many patients had died within its walls, their bodies buried in unmarked graves on the hospital grounds. There were stories of mistreatment, of patients being subjected to cruel and experimental treatments. As she dug deeper, Samantha uncovered a series of reports from the 1930s about a string of mysterious deaths. Patients who had been close to recovery suddenly took a turn for the worse and died within days. The official cause of death was often listed as complications, but the records hinted at something more sinister. There were also rumors of a nurse who had been caught performing illegal surgeries in the basement of the hospital. The surgeries were said to have been gruesome, with the patients left in unimaginable pain. The nurse had been arrested, but not before several patients had died under her care. Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that all of these events were connected. The hospital had a dark past, and it seemed that some of the spirits of those who had suffered there were still lingering, unable to move on. But why Margaret? What had happened to her that was so terrible, so tragic, that her spirit was trapped in this place? Samantha knew that she needed to find out more about Margaret's time in the hospital. The records she had found so far were incomplete, and she had a feeling that the answers she sought were hidden away in the most obscure corners of the archives. One night, after her shift ended, Samantha made her way down to the basement. She had obtained a key from a sympathetic maintenance worker, who had warned her to be careful. There were parts of the basement that hadn't been touched in decades, and the structure was unstable. The basement was even more unnerving than she had expected. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from the flashlight she carried. The walls were lined with old medical equipment, rusted and decayed from years of neglect. The floor was uneven, and she had to watch her step to avoid tripping over debris. As she made her way deeper into the basement, she found a door that was partially hidden behind a stack of old boxes. The door was locked, but the key she had fit perfectly into the rusty lock. With a creak, the door swung open, revealing a narrow corridor that led to a small, windowless room. The room was filled with old filing cabinets, their drawers jammed with documents. Samantha began to sift through them, pulling out files at random and scanning their contents. Most of the files were from the 1950s, and many of them were records of patients who had been admitted for various mental health issues. Then she found it, a file with Margaret O'Reilly's name on it. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing a series of notes from the doctors who had treated her. The notes described Margaret's declining mental state, her increasing paranoia, and her frequent outbursts. But there was something else, something that made Samantha's blood run cold. Margaret had claimed that she was being haunted. She had told the doctors that she saw shadows moving in the corners of her room, heard whispers in the night, and felt an overwhelming sense of dread whenever she was alone. The doctors had dismissed her claims as delusions, a symptom of her dementia. But Samantha knew better. Margaret hadn't been delusional, she had been telling the truth. The hospital was haunted, and whatever was haunting it had taken a particular interest in Margaret. The last entry in the file was dated the day before Margaret disappeared. It was a brief note, written in hurried handwriting, stating that Margaret had become increasingly agitated and had begged the staff to move her to a different room. She had claimed that it was coming for her, and that she couldn't stay in that room any longer. The staff had ignored her pleas, and the next day, Margaret was gone. Samantha closed the file, her mind racing. Margaret hadn't simply disappeared, something had taken her. And whatever it was still here, lurking in the shadows of the hospital, waiting for its next victim. As she left the basement, Samantha knew that she had to find a way to stop whatever was haunting the hospital. She couldn't let Margaret's fate befall anyone else. But deep down, she feared that it was already too late. Chapter 5: The Descent. Samantha's obsession with uncovering the truth began to take a toll on her. She could no longer sleep, her nights plagued by nightmares of Margaret's ghostly figure and the dark presence that had claimed her. She became increasingly isolated, pushing away her colleagues and friends, unable to explain what she was experiencing. She started spending more time in the hospital's basement, convinced that the answers she sought were hidden there. She would often lose track of time, emerging hours later covered in dust and grime, her mind buzzing with the fragments of information she had uncovered. But the more she learned, the more she realized that she was in over her head. The hospital's history was darker than she had ever imagined, and the spirits that lingered within its walls were far more powerful than she had anticipated. One night, as she was searching through the basement archives, she heard a faint whisper. It was so soft that she almost missed it, but when she heard it again, she froze. The voice was distant, echoing through the empty corridors, and it sent a chill down her spine. Samantha. The voice was barely audible, but it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was calling her name. She turned off her flashlight, plunging the basement into darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest as she strained to hear the voice again. Samantha. This time, the voice was closer, clearer. It was coming from deeper within the basement, from a part of the hospital that had been sealed off for years. Ignoring the voice in her head that told her to turn back, Samantha began to walk towards the source of the sound. The air grew colder with each step, and she could feel the darkness closing in around her, suffocating her. As she rounded a corner, she saw a faint light at the end of the corridor. It was coming from a room that she hadn't noticed before, a room that she was certain hadn't been there the last time she had been in the basement. She approached the door cautiously, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room was an old, wooden chair, and sitting in the chair was Margaret. But this wasn't the Margaret that Samantha had seen before. This Margaret was younger, healthier, her face full of life. She looked up at Samantha with sad eyes, and Samantha felt a pang of sorrow in her chest. Margaret, Samantha whispered, stepping into the room. Is it really you? Margaret nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving Samantha's. I've been waiting for you, she said, her voice soft and melodic. You're the only one who can help me. Samantha felt a tear slip down her cheek. How can I help you, Margaret? What do you need? Margaret's expression darkened, and the room seemed to grow colder. You need to stop it, she said, her voice now laced with urgency. You need to stop it before it's too late. Stop what? Samantha asked, her voice trembling. But before Margaret could answer, the light in the room flickered, and a shadowy figure appeared in the corner. The figure was tall and menacing, its form shifting and undulating as if it were made of smoke. Margaret's eyes widened in fear, and she reached out to Samantha. It's here, she cried. It's coming for you. Samantha felt a surge of panic as the shadowy figure began to move towards her. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside the room with the entity. She could feel the darkness closing in around her, suffocating her, and she knew that she was out of time. Whatever this entity was, it was more powerful than anything she had ever encountered, and it wasn't going to let her leave this room alive. Desperation took hold, and Samantha began to chant a prayer, her voice trembling as she recited the words. The shadowy figure paused, as if taken aback, but then it continued its advance, undeterred by her efforts. Margaret's voice cut through the darkness, sharp and clear. You have to destroy it. It's the only way. But Samantha didn't know how to destroy it. She didn't even know what it was. All she knew was that she was running out of time, and if she didn't do something soon, she would be lost to the darkness, just like Margaret. In a last-ditch effort, Samantha reached into her pocket and pulled out the crucifix that she always carried with her. She held it up, pointing it at the shadowy figure, and shouted, "In the name of God, I command you to leave this place." The figure stopped, its form wavering, and for a moment, Samantha thought that it might actually work. But then the figure began to laugh, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down her spine. "You cannot stop me," it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "I am eternal. I am the darkness that consumes all." The crucifix in Samantha's hand began to burn, and she cried out in pain, dropping it to the floor. The figure moved closer, its presence overwhelming, and Samantha knew that she was about to die. But just as the figure reached her, Margaret's voice rang out, stronger than before. "Samantha, now! Destroy it!" With the last of her strength, Samantha grabbed the crucifix from the floor and plunged it into the heart of the shadowy figure. There was a blinding flash of light, and the figure let out a blood-curdling scream. Samantha was thrown back against the wall, the force of the blast knocking the wind out of her. She gasped for breath, her vision swimming, and as the light faded, she saw the shadowy figure dissolve into nothingness. Margaret's form began to fade as well, her expression one of peace. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You've freed me." And then she was gone, leaving Samantha alone in the dark, empty room. Epilogue: The legacy of the haunting. In the days that followed, Samantha found herself haunted by the events that had transpired in the basement. The hospital had returned to its normal state, the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over it for so long now lifted. But Samantha knew that the scars would remain, both on the hospital and on her. She resigned from her position, unable to continue working in a place that held so many dark memories. She tried to move on, to leave the past behind, but the images of Margaret and the shadowy figure continued to haunt her dreams. One day, she received a letter in the mail. It was from Evelyn, Margaret's daughter, who had somehow found out about Samantha's involvement in the case. The letter was brief, but it conveyed a sense of gratitude that brought tears to Samantha's eyes. Evelyn thanked Samantha for helping her mother find peace and for uncovering the truth about what had happened all those years ago. She also mentioned that she had visited the hospital and that, for the first time in decades, she felt a sense of closure. But even as she read the letter, Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness she had encountered wasn't truly gone. It had been banished, yes, but something that powerful couldn't be destroyed so easily. It was out there, somewhere, waiting for the right moment to return. And when it did, Samantha knew that she would be ready. She had faced the darkness before, and she had survived. And no matter what came next, she would continue to fight. Because some things were worth fighting for, like peace, like justice, like the memory of a lost soul who had finally found her way home. But deep down, Samantha knew that the darkness was always lurking, just beyond the edges of her vision, waiting for the right moment to strike. And when it did, she would be there, ready to confront it once more. The end of The Wandering Woman. The second dose, The Sobbing Girl. Chapter 1, The Echoes of Sorrow. The hospital was quiet at night, with only the faint hum of machinery and the occasional shuffle of footsteps echoing through the dimly lit corridors. Nurse Emily had just started her night shift, her third in a row, and she was already feeling the exhaustion creeping in. But the quiet was a deceptive calm, for within these walls, there were things that defied explanation. It was around midnight when Emily first heard it, a soft, pitiful sobbing that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. She paused in her rounds, the sound sending a chill down her spine. She glanced around, but the corridor was empty. The sobbing continued, faint and sorrowful, as if it were coming from a distant place. "Who's there?" Emily called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The sobbing stopped abruptly, leaving only the eerie silence of the hospital in its wake. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen, listening for any further sounds. But there was nothing, only the oppressive stillness that seemed to press in on her from all sides. Shaking off the unease, Emily resumed her rounds, telling herself that it was probably just one of the patients having a nightmare. But as she made her way through the ward, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, something that was just out of sight. The sobbing returned the next night, this time louder and more desperate. Emily was in the break room, sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee, when she heard it. The sound was coming from one of the nearby toilets, the one at the end of the corridor that was rarely used. She set her cup down and walked towards the sound, her footsteps echoing in the empty hall. The sobbing grew louder as she approached the door, and Emily felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She reached for the door handle, hesitating for a moment before pushing it open. The bathroom was empty, the cubicles all unoccupied, but the sobbing continued, now muffled and echoing as if it were coming from behind the walls. Emily stepped inside, her heart racing as she checked each cubicle, but there was no one there. She was about to leave when she noticed something strange. The air in the bathroom was colder than the rest of the hospital, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible scent of lilies, an odd smell for a hospital bathroom. Emily shivered, rubbing her arms as she tried to shake off the chill. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. "Is anyone here?" The sobbing stopped, and for a moment, the silence was so complete that Emily could hear the blood rushing in her ears. Then, just as she was about to turn and leave, she heard a whisper. She never came back. The voice was faint, almost like a breath of wind, but it was unmistakable. Emily spun around, her eyes wide with fear, but the bathroom was still empty. She backed out of the room, her heart pounding as she hurried down the corridor, not daring to look back. That night, as Emily lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the sobbing and the voice. There was something deeply unsettling about it, something that tugged at the edge of her consciousness, refusing to be ignored. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was just her imagination, or maybe the hospital's old plumbing playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew that it was something more, something that she couldn't explain. And as she drifted off to sleep, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't done with her yet. Chapter 2: The Legend of the Weeping Child. The next day, Emily couldn't stop thinking about the sobbing in the bathroom. She asked some of the other nurses if they had ever heard anything strange at night, but most of them just shrugged it off. But one of the older nurses, an experienced woman named Mrs. Hawthorne, paused when Emily mentioned the sobbing. A shadow crossed her face, and she glanced around to make sure no one else was listening before leaning in closer. "You heard the sobbing in the toilet at the end of the corridor?" Mrs. Hawthorne asked in a low voice. Emily nodded, her curiosity piqued. "Yes, but there was no one there. Just this coldness, and a strange smell of lilies." Mrs. Hawthorne's expression grew grave, and she lowered her voice even further. "That's the weeping child. There's a story among the old staff about a little girl whose mother died here many years ago. The girl was inconsolable, crying day and night. One day, she disappeared. They say she took her own life, unable to bear the grief. And ever since then, you can hear her crying in that bathroom. It's said that she waits for her mother to come back for her, but of course, she never does." A chill ran down Emily's spine as she listened to the story. But why is she still here? Why hasn't she moved on? Mrs. Hawthorne sighed, her eyes filled with sorrow. Some say it's because her soul is trapped, bound to this place by her grief. Others believe that she doesn't even realize she's dead, that she's still waiting for her mother, unable to accept the truth. Emily shuddered, the weight of the story pressing down on her. She had always been skeptical of ghost stories, but there was something about the weeping child that felt disturbingly real. The coldness, the lilies, the sobbing, it all seemed too specific to be just a coincidence. That night, as she prepared for her shift, Emily found herself dreading the moment when she would have to walk past the bathroom again. She tried to convince herself that it was just a story, but the fear gnawed at her, refusing to be dismissed. And as she stepped into the corridor, the lights flickering overhead, she couldn't shake the feeling that the weeping child was waiting for her. Chapter 3: The Haunting Intensifies. The sobbing became a nightly occurrence, growing louder and more desperate with each passing day. Emily could no longer ignore it, the sound echoing in her mind even when she was away from the hospital. It was as if the weeping child had latched onto her, pulling her deeper into the darkness that surrounded her. She tried to avoid the bathroom, taking longer routes to bypass it, but the sobbing followed her, growing louder whenever she was near. The coldness seeped into her bones, and the smell of lilies became overwhelming, clinging to her clothes and skin no matter how much she tried to wash it away. Emily's nightmares became more vivid, filled with images of a little girl with tear-streaked cheeks, her eyes hollow and lifeless. In her dreams, the girl would reach out to Emily, her tiny hands cold as ice, begging her to bring her mother back. Please, she never came back. The words echoed in Emily's mind, haunting her even when she was awake. She began to see the girl in the corners of her vision, a fleeting shadow that vanished whenever she tried to focus on it. The hospital, once a place of healing, had become a prison, its walls closing in on her as the weeping child's presence grew stronger. One night, as she was making her rounds, Emily heard the sobbing again, louder than ever. It was coming from the bathroom, but this time, it was different. The sobs were punctuated by a soft whispering, as if the girl was speaking to someone. Emily hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle. Every instinct told her to turn back, to leave the hospital and never return. But something compelled her to open the door, a force stronger than her fear. The bathroom was dark, the light flickering weakly overhead. The sobbing had stopped, replaced by the sound of shallow breathing. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped inside, her eyes straining to see in the dim light. And then she saw her, the weeping child, standing in the middle of the room, her back turned to Emily. The girl was wearing a tattered hospital gown, her hair matted and unkempt. She was staring at the wall, her shoulders shaking as if she were crying, but no sound came from her lips. Emily felt a lump form in her throat as she watched the girl. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" The girl didn't respond, but slowly, she began to turn around. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she saw the girl's face, pale and ghostly, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to bore into her soul. "She never came back," the girl whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. "Why didn't she come back?" Emily felt a tear slip down her cheek, her heart breaking for the lost soul in front of her. "I don't know," she said softly, "but I'm here now. I'll help you find her." The girl's expression changed, her eyes widening with hope. But before Emily could say anything more, the bathroom door slammed shut, and the lights went out. Emily was plunged into darkness, the air thick with the scent of lilies. The girl's breathing grew louder, more frantic, and Emily could feel the coldness closing in around her, suffocating her. "Please don't leave me," the girl's voice whispered, filled with desperation. Emily reached out blindly, trying to find the girl, but her hands grasped only air. The darkness seemed to press in on her, and she felt a cold hand brush against her arm. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The lights flickered back on, and the bathroom was empty. The girl was gone, and the only sound was Emily's ragged breathing. She stumbled out of the bathroom, her legs shaking as she leaned against the wall for support. The scent of lilies lingered in the air, a reminder of the encounter she had just experienced. But as she looked down at her arm, she saw something that made her blood run cold, a small, hand-shaped bruise, as if someone had gripped her with all their strength. Emily knew then that the weeping child wasn't just a story. She was real, and she was desperate to find her mother. And Emily was the only one who could help her. Chapter 4: The Descent into Darkness. The next few nights were a blur of fear and exhaustion. Emily barely slept, her mind consumed by the weeping child and the encounter in the bathroom. She could still feel the coldness of the girl's touch, the bruise on her arm a constant reminder of the terrifying reality she was facing. She tried to confide in some of her colleagues, but they dismissed her concerns, chalking it up to stress and lack of sleep. Even Mrs. Hawthorne, who had told her the story, seemed reluctant to talk about it any further, her eyes filled with a sadness that Emily couldn't understand. Desperate for answers, Emily began to dig deeper into the hospital's history, searching for any records of the girl and her mother. But the more she searched, the more she realized that there were no official records, no names, no dates, nothing to prove that the girl had ever existed. It was as if the hospital itself was trying to erase her, to bury the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. But Emily was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. One night, she stayed late after her shift, poring over old files and documents in the hospital's archive room. The room was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. The only light came from a flickering desk lamp, casting long shadows across the walls. As she flipped through the yellowed pages of an old ledger, she found something that caught her eye. A brief mention of a little girl who had been admitted to the hospital years ago, her mother having died in a tragic accident. The entry was short, almost dismissive, but it confirmed what Emily had feared. The girl had been real, and her story had been all but forgotten. But there was something else, something that sent a shiver down Emily's spine. The entry mentioned that the girl had been placed in a special ward, one that was no longer in use. It was located in the oldest part of the hospital, a section that had been closed off years ago due to structural issues. Emily knew that she had to see it for herself. She had to find the ward where the girl had been kept, to see if there were any clues that could help her understand why the girl's spirit was still lingering. She made her way to the old section of the hospital, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. The air was colder here, the walls cracked and peeling with age. The lights flickered ominously, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. As she reached the door to the old ward, Emily hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it impenetrable. She could feel the cold air seeping through the gap, carrying with it the faint scent of lilies. Taking a deep breath, Emily pushed the door open and stepped inside. Chapter 5: The Final Confrontation. The old ward was a relic of the past, its walls lined with rusted beds and broken furniture. The windows were boarded up, letting in only slivers of moonlight that cast an eerie glow across the room. The air was thick with dust, and every step Emily took seemed to stir up memories of the patients who had once occupied the space. But it was the silence that unnerved her the most. It was an unnatural silence, one that pressed in on her from all sides, making her feel as though she were being watched. Emily made her way through the ward, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the coldness growing stronger, the scent of lilies more overpowering than ever. It was as if the very walls were alive, whispering secrets that had been buried for years. And then she saw it, a small, tattered doll lying on one of the beds, its glassy eyes staring up at her. The sight of it sent a chill down her spine, and she felt a surge of unease wash over her. She reached out to pick up the doll, but as her fingers brushed against it, a sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the light from her lantern. Emily gasped, her heart racing as she was plunged into darkness. The coldness closed in around her, and she could hear the faint sound of sobbing, growing louder with each passing second. It was the weeping child, and she was here. Emily turned around, her eyes straining to see in the darkness. The sobbing was coming from the far corner of the room, and as she took a step closer, she could see the faint outline of the girl, her figure barely visible in the shadows. "Why didn't she come back?" the girl whispered, her voice trembling with sorrow. Emily felt tears well up in her eyes, her heart breaking for the lost soul in front of her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm so sorry." The girl looked up at her, her hollow eyes filled with pain. "You said you would help me find her." "I tried," Emily said, her voice choked with emotion. "But she's not here. She's gone." The girl's expression twisted with anguish, and she let out a heart-wrenching wail that echoed through the room. The sound was so raw, so filled with pain, that it made Emily's blood run cold. And then, suddenly, the wailing stopped. The girl's figure began to fade, her body dissolving into the darkness. But before she disappeared completely, she whispered one final word. "Please." The word hung in the air, a plea that echoed in Emily's mind long after the girl was gone. Epilogue. The haunting continues. In the days that followed, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of sorrow that had settled over her. The weeping child's final plea haunted her, a constant reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within the hospital's walls. The coldness and the scent of lilies still lingered, a faint but constant presence that reminded her that the girl's spirit had not found peace. Emily knew that she had done all she could, but it didn't feel like enough. The girl's pain was too deep, her grief too overwhelming to be healed by a simple apology. Emily left the hospital shortly after, unable to bear the weight of the haunting any longer. She moved to a different city, started a new job, and tried to put the past behind her. But the memories of the weeping child followed her, a shadow that she couldn't escape. And every now and then, in the quiet moments of the night, Emily could still hear the faint sound of sobbing, as if the weeping child was still searching for her mother, still waiting for the day when she would finally come back. But deep down, Emily knew that day would never come. The end of The Sobbing Girl. The end.
Thanks for tuning in to our podcast. If you enjoyed our exploration of ghosts, mythical creatures, and urban legends, please share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling episodes. Until next time, my beloved listeners.